Clarence Thomas. I'm a third-generation retired member of ILWU Local 10, past Secretary-Treasurer, the co-founder of the Million Worker March movement, and Declare Publishing, author of an anthology titled Mobilizing in Our Own Name, Million Worker March, and publisher of a recent release book that was released on May Day. It's called Cleophas Williams, My Life Story in the ILWU Local 10. And for those who may not be familiar with Cleophas, he was the Jackie Robinson of the ILWU. He was the first African-American to be elected president of a Longshore Local in 1967. And that has particular significance with regards to the subject matter of today, Harry Belafonte and the links to the ILWU, because in 1967, Dr. King addressed the members of the Local 10, held a press conference, and was made an honorary member. And I'll get into that more in detail, but I'm glad to be with you, Steve, to talk about this important revolutionary artist.
Belafonte was in a struggle all his life for justice against racism, and he was very close to Paul Robeson. So talk about that history of his relationship with Paul Robeson, who was a tremendous actor, musician, singer, who then was banned and attacked physically during the witch hunts in this country.
It would not be an overstatement to say that Paul Robeson is one of the great figures on the world stage of the 20th century. This was a man of beyond remarkable talents. I mean, this guy, first of all, he attended Rutgers University, and at the time, I don't think there were more than a handful of blacks that had ever attended that school. But his father was an educated man, and so was his mother. So education was a major factor in the Robeson household. And I think that one of the most remarkable things about Robeson was, as an African American of great stature, he basically achieved his fame really in Europe, in London, and he found much less racism there, and contemplated living there. But he was a man who was extraordinary in this respect. He was very political, and he was anti-colonial. It would be fair to say that before Malcolm X, before the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were on the world stage in terms specifically of their work regarding the civil rights and the Black liberation movement, it was people like Paul Robeson who were those individuals that were doing that work. And in fact, the United States government and the ruling class had gone to great lengths in terms of mitigating or wiping out the contributions of the black left, such as people like Paul Robeson and William Bill Patterson, who was an attorney who attended Hastings Law School and grew up here in the Bay Area. But Paul Robeson was an extraordinary man in terms of his art, his singing, acting, All-American football player, Phi Beta Kappa, spoke many languages. But he was a man who was committed to socialism, and that's something that I don't think is underscored enough. And he was an honorary member of the ILWU in 1943. In my book about Cleophas Williams, one of Cleophas's first jobs when he migrated to the Bay Area in 1942 was to be hired at Moore Shipyard. So there's an iconic photo of Robeson singing to workers Edmore Shipyard in Oakland. And the workers are sitting down and he's standing up, and it's really quite an iconic photograph. It's been shown in many places. But I wasn't able to find out from Cleophas if he was at that particular performance. But suffice it to say that he was employed there in 1942 when Robeson sang. Robeson had a very close relationship with labor. And I think that was one of the things that really clicked in my conversations with Harry Belafonte, because he knew a great deal about the ILWU, specifically about bridges, and that had to do with his association with Robeson. Robeson was a man who was, I guess, one of the first who we could really point to, and we could say that he used his art and his, what is commonly referred to, his platform as a celebrity, to advance the causes of the working class and the oppressed. And so this is what he has, he laid the foundation for people like Harry Belafonte and Danny Glover, who's a contemporary of ours. In terms of the backlash or pushback against Robeson was, now we have to, for the listening audience who may be younger, they may not know in the fight against fascism, the United States and Russia were on the same side during World War II. The Russians lost millions of people in the war against Nazi Germany. And so there was a period in time in the country where, being a member of the Communist Party was not regarded in the same degree as it might have been now, because some of the most committed trade unionists were those who were either members of the party or who were leftists or who were Marxist-Leninists, or people who were, I guess you could describe, some might have been anarchists, but they were the ones who were not sellouts. They believed in the principles of democracy and rank and file unity and solidarity. So it wasn't until World War II was over that we saw this big shift in terms of the Cold War and development of the national security state under Harry Truman, that we began to see that the political shift in the country, in terms of Russia one time being an ally, now they were public enemy number one, and a great deal of that had to do with the fact that coming out of World War II, the United States was, a dominant figure on the world stage in terms of the economy. Europe is in shambles. Japan had been defeated. And so we had the kind of, I guess the best way to describe it is that, Russia was public enemy number one. And so Robeson, having visited there and who spoke about how there was not racism in the country in Russia, and he acknowledged that. And so the United States government, moved against him, and what they not only did they take his passport away, but it was his way to earn a living, but he was basically written out of history. In my first book, Mobilizing in Our Own Name, the Million Worker March, I speak of the first time I ever heard of the name Paul Robeson, which was at my maternal grandfather's home, and he was a longshore worker, and he was the one that introduced me to whom Paul Robeson was. And as an 8-year-old, I had a very difficult time trying to grasp why it was that I had not heard of this man. I mean, I was 8 years old. I was reading the newspaper. I was familiar who Harry Bridges was, because my grandfather talked about Harry Bridges, and the people who came over to the house, his house, talked about him. I knew who Jackie Robinson was. I knew who Martin Luther King was, but I couldn't figure out why is it that someone who my grandfather held in such high esteem and who was all of these famous things, and I didn't know who he was. And so that was my first, I guess, introduction to how the system had, blacklisted him and basically had written him out of history, and very effectively. And so there's a lesson to be learned from that. But his commitment to the working class, in particular to workers, because Robeson believed that he could reach people, if not by his words, then by his songs. And he saw a commonality with various folk music, and he was able to draw a link between African American spirituals and folk music of Europe, Gaelic culture and Welsh culture, and he had sang in in front of workers in various countries, and even in China, so this was a man who was extraordinary and who was fearless and who had a great deal of courage, and he paid a significant price for that. Not only was a loss of income, but he was there were he was isolated, and it had an impact on him in terms of his own mental state and his ability to do the things. It's quite something to be famous and well known and on a worldwide basis, and to have the ire of the United States, working against you in terms of not only preventing you from making a living, but making you persona non grata, so to speak. And so when we talk about Harry Belafonte, we have to talk about Robeson, which we've done here, because he was a mentor to Robeson, and I think that one of the things that we could say about Harry Belafonte was that he also was a courageous artist. He was someone who spoke about his admiration for Robeson and how Robeson served as a role model for him in terms of how he thought artists should, artists have a role to play in society. And Robeson talked about, he said, artists either are going to, fight for freedom, or they're going to fight for enslavement, fight to be slave. You're going to either fight for slavery or against it. And he firmly believed that. And I think that when we look at Harry Belafonte, and one of the things that's so extraordinary about him is that both of us, Steve, were children during the 1950s. And I can remember so well his emergence as an artist. He introduced the United States audience to the calypso music. And I can remember so well seeing him on the cover of Ebony magazine and other publications, and seeing him on album covers and on television. And at the same time that he was being adored, and he was. Let's face it. I mean, we live in a country that exploits, people's appearance and looks. And he was considered like a world sex symbol. I mean, he was I remember him so well. I mean, light tan, a man of color, who presented himself in a way that was so different from other entertainers. You didn't see him in suits, and he didn't wear his hair processed. He was a guy who appeared in a shirt, and the shirt that he wore, it accentuated his physique, and he was singing a music that was Caribbean, and it was different, and he made you pay attention to the words. I thought it was more than ironic that his first hit, the Banana Boat song, what many of us know to be Deo, is a song about dock workers loading bananas. And it's extraordinary. And in that it's, I had really never paid that much attention to it until, many years ago, where I said, oh, he's talking about, the dock workers. And my father and my grandfather and my uncle, they loaded bananas. And then when he talks about the tallyman, he's talking about the Marine clerks who basically count the cargo and make sure, and he talks about the tarantulas and talks about the various sizes of the bunches of bananas. And, a lot of longshore workers didn't like working bananas because of the issue of the spiders. But this man was extraordinary in that regard. And there had been attempts to blacklist him too, and to hear Harry Belafonte talk about it, he said that Ed Sullivan, who's had a very popular television show, variety show in the 1950s and 60s, and a lot of us watched that show because it was diverse. You would see jugglers and comedians, and at the same time you would see people like Paul Robeson, or you might see Nina Simone or Diana Ross and the Supremes. They would all be on with this one show. But what was interesting is that the FBI was basically trying to blacklist him because of his association with Robeson, and also because of the fact that he was an activist. And so Paul describes how the FBI was basically trying to keep him off of that show. And apparently there was some conversation, between Sullivan and the producers or whatever, and they were trying to get him off the show. But one of the things that was remarkable, and Sullivan was Irish, and Harry Belafonte pointed out to Ed Sullivan about the commonality of the struggles of the people of Ireland and African Americans. And that was rather extraordinary because Ed Sullivan got it. And Ed Sullivan put Harry on the show. And when you appeared on Ed Sullivan's show back in those days, I mean, that was your ticket to success, because that brought you right into the American homes on Sunday evenings. And so I thought that was a remarkable thing that happened. But we need to understand something about this man. He really was a revolutionary. I mean, how else can you describe a black man in Hollywood who is able to not only support the civil rights movement in a meaningful way, which we will talk about later, but he was also able to get some of the leading Hollywood stars to come out and support the March on Washington. I mean, like, my mother was a movie buff when I was a child, and that kind of made me one. But people like Tony Curtis, Charlton Heston, and so many, many more, they all came to the March on Washington in 1963. So not only was he a supporter of the civil rights movement, he was an organizer. And when you think about what it is that revolutionaries do, a lot of us, kind of missed the boat on that because we romanticize so much about revolutionaries, and we look to people, Fidel and Lenin and various other, revolutionaries on the world stage. But we forget we're here in the belly of the beast. So when you look at how a person is able to move and make things happen that affect the masses, these are really revolutionary actions. We just don't put them in that kind of context. And I'm not saying that these individuals that I mentioned who came to the March on Washington movement were all leftists. I'm not suggesting that. But what I am saying is that Harry was able to organize those folks and get them there. And their celebrity status, people like Tony Bennett and others, who respected Harry Belafonte. They had to, in order to have followed his lead to the March on Washington. I think that when we, there was, I was able to find out that Belafonte and Dr. King first met in the basement of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And at that time, we're talking about two young African Americans on the world stage. Dr. King was just 27 years old, and Belafonte was 29. And at their first meeting, it said that King indicated to Belafonte that he needed his help, and of course he was talking about he needed his help, financially, and he needed his help as a celebrity, an African American celebrity who people look to because of his fame. And Harry's response was, "I got to tell you, I'm not the church," meaning that I'm not someone who is accustomed to operating within the context of the Baptist church or the clergy, because he's an entertainer and because he was radical. And so Dr. King's response, from what I read, was that he had no idea where the movement was going, and he felt that he was called upon to do things, and that he felt that he couldn't do, but yet he couldn't dismiss the calling. And so they met for 3 hours that day, and that was the beginning of their relationship. But Danny Glover had mentioned that, who was mentored by Belafonte, that Harry always was trying to figure out, how does his fame, his fortune, translate into building a movement? And Belafonte was a very wealthy man, and he used his fortune and his fame in building a movement. He not only provided financial support to the SCLC, but he also provided space for Dr. King to be able to get away from things and relax. And Harry had an apartment in Manhattan, and Dr. King had a key to that apartment to go there and relax and to get away from things. And so that relationship was extraordinary, but it was always about, how can I use my celebrity status, and how can I use my voice as an artist? And Belafonte always said that he was an activist first who became an artist. And I think that he operated that way. And so my first meeting with Belafonte was on April 5th, 2003, where he was the keynote speaker at the Stop the War in Iraq, Stop the War on Us. It was probably about 20,000 people still. I'm sure you were there that day. We started out at Mosswood Park, and then we marched down to the Franco Gower Plaza. Now we would call it Oscar Grant Plaza. But anyway, he was there. He spoke, and ILWU had a significant turnout that day. The drill team led the march, and Belafonte spoke, and Henry Graham and I followed him. And then after his speech and interview was over, Henry and I spoke with him. We welcomed him to the Bay Area, congratulated him on his speech, which was well received by those in attendance. And then he immediately expressed his admiration for Harry Bridges and the ILWU. And he was well acquainted with his history, specifically the U.S. government attempt, to have Bridges jailed and deported for being a Red. And this was happening around the same time that Paul Robeson was under attack. And so we discussed the ILWU's long history of support for progressive causes, and specifically for the fight for economic and social justice for people of color and the working class. And the discussion went into how the ILW was expelled from the CIO in 1950 because of his left-wing politics, and that one of the reasons why Belafonte was so familiar with the ILWU left-wing history was because of his association with his mentor, Paul Robeson. And so, as I mentioned,
in the issue of why there was this anti-communist witch hunt in the United States, most people don't realize that the ILWU and the left-wing unions at that time actually had an organized campaign against segregation. And the Marine Cooks and Stewards, which was a left-wing union on the West Coast, actually forced the integration of ships. They were all white, by telling the ship owners that they wouldn't sail unless there were black sailors on those ships. So I think when people think about why was there an anti-communist witch hunt, well, one of the reasons was the left-wing unions, like the ILWU, were saying we're going to actually fight racism on the job.
That's a very important point to bring out, Steve, and I'm glad that you did. And the subject of discrimination being a tool of the bosses and the history of the ILWU as it relates to the 1934 strike and appealing not only to black longshore workers, there weren't that many, but there were some in 1934. There weren't that many black people in San Francisco in the 1930s, first of all. But Bridges knew that the strike could not be won when black people were crossing the picket line. And he had to appeal not only to black longshoremen, but to the black community, because as Tom Fleming, longtime writer and pioneering black journalist in the Bay Area, he worked for the Sun Reporter. He has written in detail about how strikes represented an opportunity for black people to go to work on the docks. And because the unions were not, they were at that time, very racist, and there wasn't the political will until Bridges and people like Henry Schmidt and others emerged on the scene, who were actually Marxist-Leninists, and who understood the relationship between race and class. And Belafonte was acquainted with that history. And you're right, Steve. I think that it would be, we would be remiss if we did not point out that there was a time in this country, believe it or not, that if you were white and you believed in civil rights, you were either considered to be a communist or a communist sympathizer. And that might sound strange, but it doesn't sound strange when we look at the political climate of today, when they, meaning the right-wing neo-fascists, call Joe Biden a socialist, which nothing could be further from the truth. But any kind of a sentiment that expresses, no matter how faint or weak it may be, any gesture towards working people by Democrats is some type of a socialist commitment, which is not. But so the issue of race was a major factor in people condemning people like Harry Bridges and other leftists. And so a man like Robeson, who was praising the Russians, for not being a racist country and for coming out, against colonialism, that was a major no-no. But I think that one of the reasons why they were going after Bridges was because of his position on the question of race and the question of its relationship to class. And he understood that discrimination was a tool of the bosses. And one of the most egregious examples of an anti-democratic policy or that was in effect before the 1934 strike was the issue of the shape-up. And that was when fake union bosses would go about the business of selecting longshore workers at the start of a shift. And it was called the shape-up because what it meant was that people got chosen to go to work on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of nepotism, also kickbacks and other kinds of corruption. And it was discriminatory. And so one of the things that I mentioned on more than one occasion to our white sisters and brothers in the ILWU is that long before there were black people on the waterfront, there was discrimination. And so a great example of that was the Shape Up. And that was why the objective of the strike to have a workers' hiring hall where the workers, in fact, themselves were responsible for dispatching jobs in a democratic, non-racist, non-discriminatory manner. That was one of the major objectives. And that hiring hall was considered a revolutionary concept. And when the strike was underway under the leadership of Bridges and others in San Francisco, who were the leftists, the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, the ship owners, they were saying that this was a Bolshevik agenda plot. You understand? And that's how they perceived of the longshore work.
The communists were taking over San Francisco. That's what they said.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, that 4-day strike was really something because the city of San Francisco was paralyzed. And so that's the subject of another show. We got plenty Thursday coming up. We got plenty Thursday coming up, Steve.
That's right. But the fact that Harry Belafonte was made an honorary member of ILWU Local 10.
Oh, that is absolutely. I mean, the union was a safe haven. One of the things I'd like to mention in this book that we publish about Cleophas Williams, this is his manuscript. And so one of the things that he discusses is the fact that during the 1950s, and they had this Coast Guard screening, and it was sort of the precursor for the Transportation Worker Identification Card, otherwise known as TWIC. And what it did was to allow the feds to come in and to insinuate themselves into the politics of the union. And they did that by having people to undergo background checks before they had permission to work at the Army base and Navy base, military facilities. And so my grandfather was a victim of that, and he was not a member of the party. He was a very loyal ILWU member, and but one of the things that Cleophas talks about is that there were some people were allowed a credential to work, and other people were screened, and so sometimes there was no rhyme or reason for this, so it created a division amongst the rank and file. How is it that he was able to get clearance and I wasn't? You follow what I'm saying? And so the employers, because I think that one of the things that I've come to understand, this is why I published Cleophas's book, is that African Americans in particular, who were not lefties as such, but who were militant trade unionists, and who understood the importance of the anti-discrimination, anti-racism, the democratic and militant traditions of the ILWU, they supported those things. And so they were also targeted too, just like someone who might have been a lefty or who might have been from Eastern Europe and was looked upon as being an alien who was bringing in, Marxist Leninist philosophies to the trade union movement and all the rest of that. But those individuals were also targeted as well. And I think that, as a matter of fact, I was told, this through oral discussion, that people were asked questions when they were when they were being interviewed by the government. In some instances, they were asking questions such as, "Have you ever had a conversation with anyone who had liberal views about race mixing?" You know, they were asking questions like that. You know, have you ever been to an event where blacks and whites were mixing socially? You know, that kind of shit. And so, excuse me, but that was the degree in which, you know, and like right now, you know, in Florida, Ron DeSantis is going to be running for president. And so I can't think of the young black woman. She's a young black woman, and she's a teenager, and she spoke at Biden's inauguration, and so she received quite a bit of acclaim and admiration for her speech. Do you know that her speech has been outlawed in Florida? So history seems to be repeating itself right now. And so I think to get
this whole idea of wokeism, Ron DeSantis is supported by Elon Musk today. He went on Twitter. He's building him up. This whole idea of wokeism, that we can't talk about the Civil War in this country because it may hurt feelings.
Well, you know, that ties right back into our discussion with regard to Paul Robeson and Harold Belafonte and later Danny Glover. Let me just say this, that you know, in terms of trying to figure out as an artist in the United States of America, how can I best, you know, support struggles, and how can I use my celebrity status to advance movements? And so when we look at Belafonte, you know, we know that he was a big supporter of Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan Revolution. He was a friend of the of Cuba. He was a friend of Haiti. He was an anti-colonialist. You know, he was one of the early artists who was supporting artists who were in exile, like Hugh Masekela and others who were in exile, and he supported those artists. Miriam Makeba, so many of those revolutionary South African artists who had who could not go home, and so this is a guy who was courageous, and I think he would have had to had somebody like Paul Robeson in his life to be able to help him to navigate, you know, these situations. And so, but his support to the movement was undeniable, and he put his life on the line as well as his career. So when we talk about someone like Danny Glover, for an example, Danny had Harold Belafonte, you know, to look to. You know, one of the movies that I'm very fond of in terms of the franchise of Lethal Weapon movies that Danny was in. There was one in particular where the screenwriters included the subject matter of apartheid South Africa. And I know that Danny had certainly supported that because Danny was in the vanguard of artists and entertainers in terms of being involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. You know, he was the chairman of the Trans-Africa organization, but he was involved in promoting that cause very effectively, as well as Harold Belafonte. So I think that we have to recognize that these are revolutionary artists for this reason. They tried to make this, you know, choices in terms of the work that they do, they try to do things that promote the struggle in a certain kind of way, even if it means their choice of roles on the stage and screen. Not, just going after the money, but being concerned with how they are projected and the kind of films they want to be associated with.
The entertainment industry, the effect of the purges, the anti-communist purges in the entertainment industry, the Hollywood 10, the effort to cleanse the entertainment industry was to get those issues out of the movies, to get the issues of the fight against racism and discrimination out of the movies.
That's right. As a matter of fact, Dalton Trumbo, who was a leftist and was a major screenwriter. He did Spartacus and Roman Holiday and so many others, and even wrote under a pseudonym when he was blacklisted. When he was unable to get work, he wrote for the Dispatcher. I found that to be quite interesting. But you're absolutely right. They played a very major role in that because people go to movies, and this is where, a lot of people are able to learn things that go beyond their everyday lives. There was a period of time when movies had a great deal of impact with regards to issues such as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and other films that dealt with the issue of power and the working class and representation. So people got a chance to be able to see, this is how things should be and this is how things are, but we need to change it. And so, and I think that what happened was that you had the United States government who basically looked at the influence of Hollywood and the ideas that it could, that it had the influence over ideas and things like that. And then, so they started to imagine certain kinds of subject matter to be subversive, which is the same thing we're seeing right now with this wokeism, Steve. It's the same thing. And you had a man like Joe McCarthy who was claiming that there was a communist in every closet in the White House or in Congress. They got to be ridiculous, but it wasn't always considered ridiculous. It was very serious. And these accusations and allegations, and because during the 50s, to be called a communist, that was like being called a terrorist today. And so we need to understand that and realize how important. That's like the show that you are hosting here today is so important for people to be able to get the information because a lot of this information is documented. Some of it isn't, but you're getting firsthand information from people who were talking to folks who were a part of this movement. Let me just go on to talk about Robeson's link to the ILWU. The second time that I met Harry Belafonte, you might have been there, Steve. It was in 2008, I believe. It was the 40th anniversary of the 1968 strike, and he was at San Francisco State. I don't know if you remember that or not.
I was there.
Yeah, I figured you would be since you were there. Right.
I was there.
So anyway, but I had a brief conversation, and I wanted to let him know, hey, Danny Glover and I were part of the Black Student Union Central Committee, which initiated the strike, and which he knew about Danny, and so I was trying to just, so many people around the man, and I was trying to just let him know about why it was that he was there. I know Danny had a great deal to do with him being there because he was involved with Danny in some projects. But anyway, that was in 2008. And so the next time I saw him was in 2012. And it was in Gary, Indiana. And it was I think it was the 40th anniversary of the 1972 Black People's Convention in Gary, Indiana. And Belafonte was there, I believe. It was a number of people from various political persuasions, Jesse Jackson, Mary Baraka, Ron Dellums. It was quite a gathering, and so that was commemorating that particular event. And I had a chance to see him there, and I told him that, meaning Harry, that every time I had the opportunity to introduce my dearest friend and comrade of more than 50 years, Danny Glover, that I always say, quote, Danny's in the tradition of Paul Robeson, Harry Belafonte, and others who have used their celebrities to advance the struggle for freedom, justice, equality, and democracy for the oppressed and the working class at home and abroad. And I finally had a chance to say that to him. And his response was, whenever you need me to come out, all you got to do is get an airplane ticket and have a hotel room for me, and I'll come out. I never will forget that. That's what he said. And he was on the move then. Boy, I tell you. And then the following year, now this is really interesting, on April 8, 2013 in Queens, this was during the week of the commemoration of the 45th anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Belafonte was part of a panel which included union leaders Charles Jenkins. He's from TWU, that's Transport Workers Union Local 100. Charles was an organizer for the Million Worker March. As a matter of fact, he had me signing at a book signing last year for the Mobilizing in Our Own Name. And the other person who was on that panel was Sister Brenda Stokely, former president of AFSCME Local 215. She was the coordinator, East Coast regional coordinator for the MWM. She was an early endorser of the march and spoke at its kickoff rally with Danny Glover at the Local 10 hiring hall. So they were all on this panel together. And so that was another connection with the ILWU because we initiated the Million Worker March. Now, the purpose of this panel discussion was to compare and contrast Dr. King's struggle for economic justice in 1968 with the continuing struggle of low-wage workers, the low-wage workers find themselves in today. And Belafonte, who was one of the organizers of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 63, and Harry posed the question, quote, what happened to radical thinking? What happened to the labor movement? How did the opposition run away with all of this, leaving us here in a place of frustration, anger, and hopelessness? And also during that panel discussion, Charles Jenkins, he laid the blame on union leaders who were more interested in their six-figure salaries than the lives of their members they are supposed to serve. And I would just say that business unionism is the reason for that. And that's the whole idea of collaboration between the bosses and the unions. This thinking that the union and the bosses have something in common and that they can work together, which is nothing more than a subterfuge for the union leadership to be able to cozy up to the bosses. They feel more comfortable being with the bosses, whether or not it's playing golf or going to dinner or luncheons or on speaking tours with the bosses than they do in fraternizing and being with their own rank and file. I never will forget Brother Leo Robinson, one of the co-founders of the Million Worker March, who wrote the resolution calling for a boycott of South African cargo, saying that many of these trade unionists are more comfortable with the bosses than they are their own members. And he believed that the trade union leaders should have clauses in their contracts that if the rank and file has to take a hit, then they need to take a hit as well on their salaries. I will say this, that the ILWU does not pay some of the same salaries that other international officers make, but suffice it to say that some trade union leaders make almost as much as $1 million. And so, it's kind of difficult to associate yourself with the working class when you're making that kind of money. And so I think that we can see that business unionism, which is about the business of the union more so than it is about, and I'm not trying to say that unions don't have a responsibility to their members. First and foremost, they absolutely do. There's no question about that. But business unionism limits the role and vision of the union, because there was a time when the trade unions not only spoke on behalf of their members, they spoke on behalf of the class, the working class. And so, and they were considered to be the most advanced segment of the working class because they had organization. You mentioned early, Steve, about how people in the labor movement and the community feel comfortable coming to Local 10 and to speak because they know that they have a captive audience. They know that there is a union where there is a microphone in front of the podium and members can get up and speak. They can ask questions. They can dictate what it is they want to discuss at the meetings. They have democracy. And so a lot of unions don't operate that way. And thank goodness the ILWU does. But this business unionism is a major factor on why we see the contradictions in the trade union movement that Harold Belafonte and others were mentioning at this panel. And so let me just say this, that during that panel discussion, Sister Brenda Stokely said, striking and organizing are human rights. And you cannot be a free person if you don't have the right to withhold your labor. And I would say that there's a whole lot of trade unionists who with leaders that don't believe that. That's the last thing they want to hear is about a strike. They're very comfortable with that history. They don't want to embrace the militancy. They don't want to pay homage to the struggles of the working class. And that's one of the reasons why, May Day has been subverted and the attempts have been made to just remove it from the consciousness of the working class. And I'm so glad that ILWU Local 10, for an example, has been an advocate for reclaiming May Day. And for the last 2 decades, pretty much every May Day, and there's been some exceptions, but pretty much every May Day, we withhold our labor for 8 hours to commemorate that. But getting back to Harry and his influence on Danny Glover, I've been in the trenches with Danny, going back to 1967 when we were arrested and facing expulsion from State College for the Gator incident. That was a situation that happened where members of the Black Student Union went to the Gator office to basically express our concerns about how the Gator was writing certain articles that were undermining the Black Student Union's ability to garner money from foundations to run various programs like the Black Studies program. It wasn't a curriculum at that time, or department at that time, experimental college and other things. And so we went up there and one thing led to another and fisticuffs ensued and Danny and I were expelled from school. We were reinstated because of the students. We were able to get back in school because they didn't exercise due process. They just threw us out. But knowing him since 1967, we started State College together, and understanding Harry's influence on him as an actor and an activist and a humanitarian are just undeniable. I mentioned that he was in the vanguard of artists and entertainers opposing apartheid. But over the past 2 decades, he's collaborated with the ILWU on a number of struggles. In 2004, he was an early endorser of the Million Worker March. He's been a part of many International Workers' Day commemorations, starting with May Day 2008, when we shut down all 29 ports on the West Coast. Danny spoke at the ILWU 33rd International Convention, honoring Paul Robeson, along with Paul Robeson Jr. Danny has championed many struggles supported by the ILWU, such as the Cuban Five, Mumia Abu-Jamal. He addressed the membership on February 16th regarding Mumia. And like Belafonte and Robeson before him, he's taken radical and revolutionary actions without any hesitation. So that's not to say that he's not concerned about his ability to make a living, and he wants his career. Well, he's 1 year older than me. I'll turn 76 this year. But suffice it to say that I'm sure that his career has been impacted by his career choices and his revolutionary actions that he's taken in the past. And yet he has done so anyway. He's been unwavering in his support for the oppressed and the working class around the world. And Harry Belafonte's revolutionary social consciousness as an artist and as an activist, humanitarian, has served as a model for artists of today and of yesterday and the future, in my opinion. And I think that that's important. I also want to say that I don't want to forget to mention, women in the struggle. Oh, dear. Thank you for your interest in.
Oh, shit. Damn.
Hello, Steve.
Hi, Danny.
Oh, gosh.
I
don't know if you pushed the wrong button, or else somebody else cut us off.
I don't know who. Anyway.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say very quickly that I don't want to forget to mention women like Nina Simone, Lorraine Hansberry, even going back to Josephine Baker, who was very active in France in the anti-fascist movement. And she was the only woman who spoke at the March on Washington in 1963. But these are all women who have also contributed to the struggle. And there have been so many that have, used their celebrity status to advance the struggle and have, put their careers out there on the line for the community. They have not been people who just were chasing money. Everybody's got to make a living, and there's nothing wrong with making money. And when you're an artist, you should be paid for what you do, but at the same time, too. And I'm reminded, Steve, by something that you had something to do with, maybe about a year ago or less. You sent me a censored segment of the Smothers Brothers show. For those who are too young to remember, the Smothers Brothers were a duo. They played guitars. One guy was sort of a straight man, and the other one was a comedian. But they were actually very progressive, and I didn't find out how progressive they were until I started watching their show. And they would discuss police brutality and a whole lot of things on the show. And they really pushed the envelope. But you sent me a clip of Harry Belafonte performing, it was in 1968, the same year of the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where the pigs, attacked the demonstrators, and it was chaotic, and it was a very turbulent scene. And you sent me a clip of a performance that Harry Belafonte made on the Smothers Brothers show that had been censored. In other words, they just didn't show it. He performed the segment on the show, but we didn't see it at home. And he was using the material from folk song that he had. I can't think of. I think it's "Don't Stop the Carnival." That could be the name of the recording. But they had the back in the background. You could see the violence perpetrated against the demonstrators, and he changed the lyrics to fit the occasion. That's what I call being a revolutionary artist, man, to the fullest extent. And when the censors saw that shit, they said, "Oh, no, we're not showing this." That is not going to happen. That's what a revolutionary artist can do. And I think that I understand that, because I like to consider Ryan Coogler, who's a relative of mine, but more importantly than that, I like to consider him as being in that vein too, where he can take comic characters and Marvel movies and make revolutionary statements with them. That's what revolutionary artists can do, where they can get messages out and teach people within popular culture. And I think that that leads us back to Harry Belafonte again, is because there haven't been very many artists in this country that have been able to make the impact in U.S. popular culture and politics at the same time. Very few artists have been able to profoundly impact U.S. culture and its politics as Mr. Belafonte has been able to do. The We Are the World project, where all of those singers got together in order to raise funds for Africa. Those kind of things. I mean, when you can pull all those kind of artists together, man, Bruce Springsteen and various other artists who would never perform together had it not been for that. And Harry had a great deal to do with that. I mean, this is what revolutionary artists do. They find a way, and I think it's important to mention to people that Johnny Carson went on vacation in the late 60s. And Harry Belafonte was the host. And you know what Harry did? He had Dr. King on the show.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? Asking him questions. They right there. Johnny Carson was, was very popular in households. My parents watched Johnny Carson. My best friend, he watched Johnny Carson every night, man. And to see Harry Belafonte on that show with Dr. King, you know what I'm saying?
That's a big deal. That's a big deal.
That's a damn big deal, man. It's a damn big deal, And so that's why I made the point of when I was a kid, I watched, Huntley and Brinkley on, they only had a few. They had ABC, CBS, and ABC, CBS, and NBC. Those were the major channels we had. And that's where we saw the civil rights movement fighters who were on the front lines. That was brought to us, not in living color, but in black and white on our television networks and stations. Every night we saw the dogs being sicked on black people. And in many instances, it was young people. And so when you contrast that with Harry Belafonte's emergence in the 1950s, that was an incredible thing to see. And here this man was, who was adored by white women. So listen, there's a little. I got this off of a documentary that HBO did on Harry Belafonte. I think it goes back to maybe 2012. But he tells he gives this episode of, he was in Las Vegas. And for the younger members of the listening audience, there was a time when black people could perform in Las Vegas, but they couldn't stay in the hotels.
That's right.
Sammy Davis Jr., Harry Belafonte, and Nat Cole, and others. They could perform, but they couldn't stay at the hotels. So one day, Harry just got he just got fed up and said, and he told someone who was staying in this hotel, he said, I might not live after today. And she said, just watch me. And she said, Harry, what the hell are you going to do? So Harry had on his robe, and he had a bathing suit on. So he goes downstairs into the hotel pool, and he dives into the pool. Well, there was a time in this country if a black person couldn't swim with white folks, and so this black man dives into the pool, and everybody scurries out of the pool, right? Then when they found out that it was Harry Belafonte, they jumped back in and were asking him for autographs. It's just, we have to laugh at this stuff, Steve, because it just goes to show you how ridiculous. But it was dangerous for a black man to do something like this. And, there's so many other things I've learned about this guy, about how, he was about to do a special with Revlon. And so he was going to have, certain people on the show, and they didn't like it. And he was going to have, and Harry had white guests to come on, and white women couldn't touch black men, and vice versa. And so they had to cancel the show, but they had to pay Harry $800,000, man. Because they had a contract. And I'm saying, you know how much money $800,000 was back in the early 60s and late 50s? How much money that was, man. And here is this guy, he's supporting the civil rights movement, man. You know what I mean? He said, I took a cutout for me and my family, but I also supported the movement in a major way. And so that's what revolutionary artists do, man. So if anybody wants to know, what does a revolutionary artist do? They did what Harry Belafonte did. They did what Paul Robeson did. They do what people like Danny Glover has done. And I would expect, I know my nephew Ryan Coogler, with his Black Out for Human Rights, has done things over the years. I remember going to an event that Ryan Coogler did during the period when we learned about the contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. And he organized a benefit for people. I was there. I saw that. He had Stevie Wonder and a number of entertainers and artists who came to show support for the people of Flint and to raise the consciousness. This is what revolutionary artists do. And so, and I think that I'm glad to see Ryan Coogler and others, in the tradition of those individuals, making revolutionary movies like the movie he made about Fred Hampton. I was so surprised when he made that movie. He told me that he was going to make the movie about Fred Hampton. I said, what? I couldn't believe it, and he did, and so, this is what revolutionary artists, and the same thing could be said about people like Boots Riley. It's, these young artists who are on the scene today and who are learning from the Belafontes and the Robesons and Danny Glover. And this is what we need. We need to have people's social and political consciousness raised no matter what the repercussions are. Because as Paul Robeson said, if I cannot reach people with my words, perhaps I can reach them with my song. And I guess that may be a great place for us to end this, Steve. I wanted to thank you for having me on the show. This is very important for me because I happen to have grown up in an era where these individuals were very played very dominant roles on the world stage, and it's great to be on the show with you and all of the contributions you made in terms of documenting so many of these struggles. And these forums are so important for people, especially young people, to learn from and to be able to get some ideas as to, what the struggle is all about. And it's a continuing struggle. And as you and I have alluded to this afternoon, we're going through some of the same things that we went through, man, in the 1940s and the 1950s. With these neo-fascists, and now the Republicans are just openly embracing fascism, white nationalism. They're openly embracing it, and so that should be a wake-up call. And so we need to pay particular attention to the working class, in particular the white working classes who are succumbing to this white nationalism. And we have a responsibility to raise their social consciousness too, because they're not going to advance. And we can just look at the fact that in this country, we don't have $15 an hour as a minimum wage. And it should be twice that.
Well, one of the things is the working class mobilizing, and the gains that working people have made in this country has only come about as a result of the collective action of millions of workers. And this is something that facing a rise of fascism is critical, because we're not going to stop fascism with the Democratic Party.
That is absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct, Steve. As a matter of fact, I think it's important to point out that when Barack Obama was in power, he came in when the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. And so one of the issues that the labor movement was championing then was the issue of the Employee Free Choice Act. And do you know that there was a division amongst the Democratic Party over supporting that? You had people like Dianne Feinstein and others who were against it. And so, there's so many things that we can look at to see the capitulation. And let's just see what kind of compromises Joe Biden is going to make around the debt ceiling. Let's see what he does, because we have to remember that he made his bones. I'm speaking now of Joe Biden as a U.S. Senator from Delaware, supporting the credit card industry. And not only that, but he openly talked about his relationship with Strom Thurmond. He openly talked about it. But more so than that, we have to remember that he was a big, major opposition of busing. And I know that there's various schools of thought on the issue of busing, but here's the point. Busing was a policy, and we saw how terrible people, I'm not talking about busing in the South, I'm talking about busing in Boston, Massachusetts, and how the white working class behaved then. It was awful. Some of the most violent episodes I have seen regarding the civil rights movement. One took place in Cicero, Illinois, when Dr. King was visiting Chicago. And that's the first time I ever saw fear on Dr. King's face. People throwing rocks and shit, spitting on him. It was just terrible. But suffice it to say that Joe Biden has a very terrible history. We cannot forget the role that he played when he was overseeing the hearings for Anita Hill, when he cut off debate on Clarence Thomas. If you remember, there were other women who wanted to come forward to testify. He cut the debate off. He cut it off. And then his role with regards to the rail workers and denying them a sick pay. And he's supposed to be the most labor-friendly president ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That ain't saying much. So, yeah,
Raises the question of a working class party in this country, not only working class action. Because unless workers have their own voice, they're politically caught within the framework of the Democrats and Republicans. The racist tirade by Trump against blacks, against immigrants, against browns, unanswered by the trade union leadership. Unanswered.
You know what, Steve? As a matter of fact, a major reason for the situation that we're seeing today in the country is because the lack of the trade union movement, not having a working class party in this country. They have them in Europe. We don't even have one. And so the Democratic Party cannot serve two masters. They can't serve the working class and serve the billionaire class. That cannot happen. And furthermore, their allegiance does not lie with black people or the working class. What they are is just another voice for the ruling class. And as a matter of fact, I guess one could say that when it comes to the kind of governing that the ruling class would like to see, they would prefer the Democrats in power. But here's the thing. When the Democrats are in power, they also accomplished the Republicans' agenda. Remember, it was Bill Clinton who ended welfare as we know it. People forget that. It wasn't Ronald Reagan. It was Bill Clinton. And so we have to be very mindful of the importance of having a Labor Party. And it has to start somewhere. And I think it starts with the workers' agenda, and then you build that into a program and a party. And it's really needed right now in the country. Because the NAACP just recently came out and they said that they were encouraging the boycotting of Florida because of these reactionary policies. They are against what they call critical race theory. I saw some black children just a couple of days ago holding up a sign that's read CRT, meaning critical race theory, and a line through it. And I'm saying, I wonder if those parents agreed to have their children to be used as props like that. Because they may as well have had hanging nooses on those signs, using those children in that way. And it's absolutely astonishing that this is happening. And so the NAACP is coming out and telling people, don't come here. Do not come to the state of Florida. And, fascism is on the rise, and we need to do something about that. And I think we need more shows like this. And thank you for inviting me to come on the show today, Steve. We got a lot of work to do.
We got a lot of work. No question about it. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us.
Steve, one thing I want to say. If people want to buy my books, they can go to themillionworkermarch.com and buy Mobilizing in Our Own Name and Cleophas Williams' book, My Life Story in ILWU Local 10. That's themillionworkermarch.com. And thank you for having me on the show, Steve.
Thank you. Take care.